What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to America Trends. Larry Rifkin and John Kropsic. And John, I've got a headline in front of me. Now, this is from several weeks back. Gap, JCPenney, Victoria's Secret, Foot Locker, 465 store closures in 48 hours. Is this a competition, a race to the bottom? What's going on here?
I don't know. Well, you know what I've noticed with stores is the service is gone in most stores. You know, you go to any big box store and to find help is impossible. So it's like they're pre-dooming themselves to the internet. Well, they're giving up. They're saying, well, the internet's taken over, so we're not going to bother to put people in our stores.
Yeah, but what value do they have? I mean, why do you need to go to a regular store today unless it's to get some value added and you've won a sales associate who actually knows what they're doing, can help you, even if you ultimately decide, thank you so much, Joe, you've been fantastic, but I can get it for 10 cents less online, so I'm going home now. But you've done me a good turn. And no, that's a sad thing.
Yeah, that's not nice.
Well, you know it goes on.
Oh, I know.
All
well,
the
you
time.
see people in the stores with their phones and they're price checking against other stuff. I mean, it's just crazy out there.
No, but Joe shows it to you. You try it on, and then you go over to your phone and you order it from Amazon.
Yeah.
Jeff Bezos, he's everywhere.
It's pretty sad.
I saw another headline. Toys R Us plans second act under a new name. So they're looking for a comeback. But what we're talking about on this podcast today is retail therapy, why the retail industry is broken, and what can be done to fix it. And Mark Pilkington is our guest, John. And there is so much that I love about this interview because he's so interesting, so compelling, and there are so many facets to this story.
There certainly is. There certainly is. I mean, look at the malls today. How how dead they are. I mean, they need to attract people. They need to figure out how to get people into the malls and buy.
Well, once you're unanchored, meaning the anchor stores like Sears go away, then the place really becomes much of a lesser thing than it once was. But, you know, one of the interesting things that Mr. Pilkington is going to help us with today, and he's from the UK, is to remind us that we often talk, John, about all the additive properties of a manufacturing environment, that there are so many service jobs that come along with it. But we forget that every retail outlet is the end result of a manufacturing process and a process that draws people to a plaza and helps many other related businesses. So sometimes we think, well, you know, you lost a couple of sales associate jobs in the process, but there's much more that is lost when these jobs go away too than they have been credited with in the past.
No, I think you're absolutely right. You don't think of the domino effect that takes place.
Well, there's a whole pipeline.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about it.
Yeah.
I mean, the middlemen, those who are driving all the merchandise around. But one of the things that has always struck me, John, and we talk about it in this particular podcast, is these huge overheads. I mean, think about it. Macy's in our area, and they've got these stores all over the place.
Right.
And they've got to heat them, light them, air condition them, and just the retail space. I mean, it's pretty remarkable what they're already in for before they hired Joe as an associate.
Yeah, especially in a state like ours, which has astronomical rates. You know, you wonder how they stay in business.
I know, because think about it. They probably do most of their business in a 48-hour period from Friday to Sunday afternoon. I mean, the rest of the week, how many people are in there on a Monday at 3 o'clock?
Right, you're absolutely right.
It's difficult. Well, let's talk about retail therapy. And if you're somebody who's ever shopped Oh, I think that's everyone, John. I think
we
so.
need some therapy.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, shopping is a great tactile experience. Let's be honest about it. Whether you like shopping or you hate, and I do talk about the fact that I'm in and out pretty quickly. But, these shops that we grew up with, particularly in small downtowns,
Yep.
I mean, they defined our lives.
Yeah.
They were living characters in our story.
That's true.
So
That's true.
let's talk about it today with Mark Pilkington here on America Trends. With us on the line on America Trends is Mark Pilkington, and the book is called Retail Therapy: Why the Retail Industry is Broken and What Can Be Done to Fix It. And many of us, Mark, we do love going out shopping. I mean, historically, it's a highlight of many people's day, and yet we are finding it so convenient to go online these days that we are willing to forego that experience. And it seems as if we have worked ourselves into a crisis in many ways as a result of that.
Yes, I mean, obviously the convenience of being able to buy any which way, wherever you are, and have it brought to you does beat having to go a long distance to go and pick something up. I think that there are different types of shopping. Some shopping is, and this is what we focus on, I think, when we have this debate, is the pleasurable type, like going out. If you're a woman buying fashion, if you're a guy perhaps buying your favorite electronics, this sort of thing is pleasurable and enjoyable, particularly if you're in a nice mall or shopping center where, there are nice restaurants and other activities that you can do, maybe as a family activity. That's what people tend to focus on. But I think we need to remember that there is a lot of shopping that isn't really like that. I mean, the grocery shop where you're carrying heavy bags. It depends, of course, on the weather. Here in England, you don't tend to be able to drive to your grocery store. You have to walk and carry heavy bags, and the weather is often not very nice. So sometimes having to go out shopping can be a chore. And I think on those more basic areas of shopping is where the internet is really scoring for people.
What about something short of the demise, let's say, of retail, where now, for instance, in many urban areas in America, rather than someone not going to the store, you have a personal shopper and a group like Instacart or Grubhub going to restaurants. They act as an intermediary. Is that something that's working, at least utilizing both the modality of the internet as well as the brick and mortar to keep it alive, but also to do it in a different, more convenient fashion?
Yes, I mean, starting with the service side of food, I mean, clearly with food, it's more difficult to buy it purely online. You do need someone it needs to come to you in real time because you're hungry and you want to eat. It's a bit different from buying goods where quite often you're quite happy to have it in 24 hours or so. So I think the delivery side of the restaurant trade has done extremely well and does very well in the UK as well as in major urban centres in the US, but it's still keeping the restaurants in business, which is great news. I think when you come to goods, people are more relaxed about having delivery so long as it's within a reasonable period of time. And there, I think that the not having to go through the intermediary of a store, which is a costly entity, both in terms of its obvious costs like the wages of the staff and the rents and things like that, but also the cost of all the stock that sits in the stores as an additional stage in the supply chain, that does render online shopping potentially quite a lot cheaper. We reckon that the delivery costs on average are 8 to 12% of sales, whereas the cost of having stores can be anywhere between 25 and 40% of sales, depending on what type of operation you're running. And that's a very considerable difference in cost, which has enabled the internet companies to undercut on pricing.
And you also demonstrate to us very conclusively that the department store, as we remember it, with a whole range of items that we used to enjoy kind of tooling around and finding, is today perhaps the most endangered of all the retail stores. And I know when I go to one of the department stores still remaining in a mall close by, I can barely, if ever, find anyone who can provide a service because they have tried to cut the cost that they can cut, that being personnel.
Well, yes. I mean, this is what the problem with retailing, and you're quite right to point to department stores as being one of the what we call the longest supply chains in the business, in the consumer business, because you're not only dealing with the store costs and therefore markups, you're also dealing with brand because they mainly sell third-party brands, you're dealing with that very considerable cost and markup. And so it is reckoned that on average, if a good is produced in the factory at, say, $10, it's actually sold in the stores at $70 to $80 if it's a brand in a department store. And that is a colossal sort of collective markup, which companies like direct-to-consumer brands are starting to, by having a much shorter supply chain, are able to mark things up at much lower levels with a high-quality product and are gaining traction against the department stores because they've got a shorter supply chain fundamentally.
You make a really compelling case in the book, Retail Therapy, that I think a lot of us have focused on the loss of manufacturing, but we have underestimated the importance of this retail demise that we are in the midst of in kind of a slow motion crisis that we have. But remind us of how many sectors of our economy actually are affected by what's going on in the retail space.
Well, I mean, obviously, first and foremost, in the United States, you've got 15 million people who work directly in retailing, mainly in the stores. And that is, in itself, the biggest private sector employer. And that, by the way, is typical for most economies. It's true in Britain as well. Then behind that, you've got, as we've said, the brands and suppliers who depend on retail to be able to support their businesses. And then you have businesses that are more service businesses, whether they be logistics, warehousing, whether they be advertising agencies or property agencies that deal with retail investments. There's a whole host of PR agencies, graphic design agencies that supply the retailers that are also suffering at the moment as the retailers and, of course, the brands start to cut back on their business, on their buying. And if we put all those figures together, we've got at least 30 million people in the US, and that definitely is the biggest part of employment. And when you think about it, it's consumption and retailing is why the economy exists. I mean, we don't exist to eat steel or to drink coal juice or to we don't consume machine parts. These are all the other bits of the economy are really there to provide us with consumables and services. So if that bit of it is going to go through an enormous shake-up, it is going to affect the global economy very, very severely.
Oh, absolutely. I know that when I have done programs about manufacturing, the manufacturing sector loves to say, well, look at the multiplier effect of manufacturing jobs. And they create all of these ancillary businesses and help to support them. In a sense, you're making the argument in your book that the retail sector is perhaps the last tip of the iceberg of a tremendous chain that includes manufacturing of goods and fashion and the like, but includes a lot of intermediaries as well that I think we underestimate. And we look at the poor person who's making perhaps $10, $12, $15 an hour in America, and we say, well, those aren't great jobs to begin with. But we don't look at all the multiplier effect of the loss of retail.
Yes, and I think as also you have to look at it sort of locality by locality. The great thing about retail is that it provides jobs everywhere in every community. I mean, everywhere has shops. A lot of the internet businesses, which are going to probably replace retailing, they are actually concentrated in other areas. I mean, a lot of the jobs are in adjacent to major urban centres, whereas retailing's out in the country towns and things like that. So it's likely that the decline of retailing is going to further hit the types of communities that have already been hit. We're thinking about the Midwest, we're thinking about the Rust Belt, communities that have already been badly hit by the manufacturing decline, and are really just increasing the division within society. And I think the other thing we should remember is that it takes 4 people to do $1 million of sales in retailing, whereas it only takes slightly less than 1 person to do $1 million through an internet business. So we're not looking at a sort of just a transfer of jobs into the internet businesses. We're actually looking at a net loss of jobs, because automation is replacing a lot of the processes that used to provide jobs. So again, it could for certain communities and for the economy as a whole, it could be quite traumatic.
And for someone who doesn't believe that this decline or this perceived demise is taking place, why don't you had some incredible statistics in the book about how sharp that decline has been.
Well, in 2017, nearly 9,000 stores closed, which is the highest ever. The previous peak was around 6,000 stores, but that was at the height of the Great Recession in 2008. You kind of expect that. This was in a growth economy. Now, in 2018, we've just had the figures in, and it's around 5,000 to 6,000, which is still pretty bad. It's not as bad as 2017, mainly because the recent tax cuts have actually provided a consumer boost, which has helped some retailers to bounce back temporarily, although most economists believe it's just going to be a temporary effect. If you look at the UK, where the economy is much flatter, and perhaps the circumstances are less favourable towards retailing than they are in the US at the moment, the retail industry is really getting devastated. And I think that within 1 to 2 years from now, as the American economy slows down, you're going to see further widespread damage in terms of store closures and layoffs. So, it really is quite severe. And the number of bankruptcies, there's been, I think, 38 major brands in the US that have gone bankrupt. Every 4 or 5 years, you'd have 1 or 2 big bankruptcies in the past. Mm-hmm. But to have between 35 and 40 major bankruptcies, including Sears, Kmart, Toys R Us, Sports Authority, Payless Shoe Source, Gymboree, American Apparel. There's so many big Claire's, big names. And they're not bad brands, they're not brands that everyone knew was probably going to go at some point. And it's not just the brands that have gone bust. A lot of very, very big, powerful brands that have been, if you like, the sort of, probably they were case studies about how to do retailing. I'm talking about brands like Victoria's Secret, Polo Ralph Lauren, Abercrombie and Fitch, J. Crew. 5 to 10 years ago, they were case studies in that they were the best in the world, considered to be the best in the world. Now they haven't gone under, but they're seeing quite sustained periods of negative sales growth. So almost all brands are suffering at the moment, even what were considered to be extremely powerful ones.
You point out that it's in all sectors, all price levels, and I think you made a really important point that we might have glossed over, that this decline is not attributable really to the economy, which is relatively strong.
The American economy is as strong as it's ever been in global terms since the Second World War. Growth last year is expected to come in at sort of between 3.5 and 4%, which is right at the top end of the range. And it's been consumer-driven by the tax cuts. So if there was ever a time when retailing should be fantastic, it's right now, and yet it's not. And I think that's it's a worrying sign. I've used the phrase "canary in the coal mine." Are we seeing the first signs of another Great Recession? And as it feeds back from retailing through into the general economy, are we going to see other sectors affected as well?
You talk about the retail industry itself and their experts, and you say they are failing to understand the problem. And much of the problem, at least the way it's been described to me in other reporting that I've done on this, is that there isn't an experiential nature to a lot of the shopping, that retailers are going to have to get a lot more aggressive and compelling to get people into the stores. And I remember one of the cases being bonobos, where that becomes a man's fashion statement. It becomes an advisor, not a salesperson. How much are these retailers going to have to change to begin to confront how massive this issue is?
Well, if you go down to simple basics, retailing's always had 2 functions. It's had the physical function of distributing goods from the factories to consumers, and it's had what I call marketing. There's the store design and the interior branding, and of course the staff. So you've got 2 roles. You've got physical goods fulfillment, and you've got what I call marketing. Now, if you separate those 2 factors out and you look at the physical goods fulfillment aspect, it seems to me that the direct internet businesses have basically obsoleted that role, because these days, instead of goods having to go from the factory to the brand, to the retail central distribution center, and then out to these glorified warehouses, which we call stores, which is a very, very long cumbersome supply chain, very expensive. They can now just go more or less directly from the factory to the consumer. So I believe that in the fulfillment role, that retailing is kind of obsolete.
Mm-hmm.
However, in the second role, which is in marketing, retailing can still do things that the internet can't. And if they can build an immersive, three-dimensional brand environment which is impactful and enjoyable and educational, and if they can free up their staff and train their staff to be personal consultants, to really spend time with the consumer to understand their needs and to effectively act as personal shoppers for them, then I think that is an area where they can beat the internet. And they need to focus more on that area and let what I call the direct distribution system do the stock fulfillment. There's really, when you look at the economics of a shop, 90% of the economics of a shop is tied up with stock. The reason that shops have to be the size, and one thinks of the vast American department stores, these 200,000 square foot monstrosities, most of it is just full of stock, most of which is not moving, and really nobody has any idea whether someone's going to want to buy it or not. It's all been placed there, and that's what's driving the rent. You also have over 50% of your staff time is spent on stock processing and other basic functions, and therefore it really limits the amount of time that is available for serving consumers. And what I call the front end of most shops, which is the bit in which the staff really interacts creatively with the consumers, it's physically extremely small. It's a few basic fitting rooms, usually on the side of the store. It's not turned into the main event, mm-hmm. which is what it needs to be. And it's so much cheaper just to ship the goods through a direct business, through an internet business, that really all that vast space and time, staff time that is devoted to stock is really a waste. And it's also meant, as you've said, that retailing is a minimum wage job. There are no staff because they've cut all the wrong things. Instead of cutting the space and the stock, which is really driving that space, and doing more direct shipment, they've been cutting the one bit that could save them, which is the staff, and also the marketing. The way that the brand comes across in the store, it can be made very impactful, but they're not doing that. So they're losing out on the one bit where they could really compete.
It sounds analogous to newspapers where they have so much overhead and printing presses and the like, and the one area that they have some discretion is in their news reporting staff, so they cut that, but then they caught the reason that people want to buy the newspaper to begin with. Well, Mark Pilkington, Retail Therapy, Why the Retail Industry is Broken and What Can Be Done to Fix It. We will talk about some of the ideas you have to fix it, but tell us a story. What happened, for example, to Toys R Us? I think a lot of people were stunned. I mean, Toys R Us was one of the busiest franchises we can all remember when we had young children. I don't have them any longer, and I don't have grandchildren yet, but it was really an indispensable part of the life of a young family. And now I'm reading, and maybe this is a canary in the coal mine suggesting a reemergence, but Toys R Us plans second act under a new name. And this was just in a newspaper I was reading yesterday. And the person who's looking to buy it said, the company will focus on experiences in the physical stores, which could be about 10,000 square feet. Original Toys R Us stores were about 40,000 square feet. So tell us what happened, and what do you think about this reemergence possibly happening?
Well, I think it's a step in the right direction. Many of these brands do have several lives. I don't think it necessarily means that it's... I don't want to sound negative, but I don't think it may not save it. Quite a lot of these brands have gone bankrupt 3 or 4 times and eventually get liquidated. One of the things that companies are using, Chapter 11, and in the UK they use a similar kind of process called a company voluntary arrangement. They're actually using that to be able to unwind a lot of their store leases. In other words, they go bust, and therefore then they can close a lot of stores and basically not pay the landlords because they're in Chapter 11, and then emerge with a much slimmer, leaner store portfolio with more of their reliance being on the internet side of their business, which they then try and expand aggressively. What we've been talking about, which is having smaller stores, making them more experiential and doing more of the delivery and more of the stock, direct to the home. So, I ran a toy business and, the stock is extremely bulky. And, as you know, if you remember your children's rooms, I mean, and when it's in the packaging, it's very bulky. So if you're going to do what most toy retailers do and have backup stock of, maybe 10 pieces or something like that, it makes the store very, very large, and it's very cumbersome to operate. Because really all you need is one of each toy to demonstrate it, really preferably unpacked and out on low tables where the kids can play with it. And if they want it, you can then ship it straight from your internet distribution center to their, sign them up and ship it directly to their home, within 24 hours for free or something like that. And your store really is a kind of showroom where you show all. It's an experiential, joyful sort of place, rather than having everything packaged up where the kids can't touch it, which is what toy stores tend to be. It's all out there and they can play with it and interact with it in a direct way. So I think that if you make a toy store like that, it becomes A, a lot more fun for the kids, and B, an awful lot more efficient in terms of cost.
The only thing is, Mark, that my children, they wanted it and they wanted to go home with it. That's the only problem with children, I think. What about aside from the...
That's true, although as a parent, you've still got the kind of the veto that I think, if you're looking at something where the economics is fundamentally different, which it could be, we all know how expensive toys are when you've got kids and the kids want them. For a lot of families, it's something that's difficult to afford. By doing what I've described, you basically cost 40% to manage their children. I agree that there is that urgent thing, but expensive business, and anything that to make it, I think, is to the good.
Aside from the Amazon effect, and everyone knows about the Amazon effect on these brick and mortar facilities, you talk about information revolution, generational changes, the role of private equity in retail debt levels. To the layman, just break that down very briefly for us.
Yeah, I think it's very easy to point at Amazon and say, there's the culprit. I don't think it's just about that. There is an enormous demand-side problem. Really, Amazon's about the supply side, about, how you supply goods to consumers. The demand side is definitely going through a tremendous crisis, or going into a tremendous crisis, which is really caused by generational inequality. And to put that in a short way, if you take when I was growing up, I bought a house for about 3.5 times my earnings. I was able to buy a property for 3.5 times my earnings. That house now, that type of house, for someone the same age as me, as I was, in my mid-20s when I bought it, would now be 10 times their earnings. And therefore, it's actually very unaffordable for them. And both in England and America, people over 45 control about 85 to 90% of all the wealth, and the people under 45 only control about 15 to 20% of the wealth. So what you've got is the sort of baby boomers retiring and cutting back on their retail spending, although they're spending on other things. They're spending on healthcare and other activities, but not really on retailing so much anymore, because they have a lot of the retail goods already. They're more actually throwing things out rather than acquiring.
Yes.
And then you've got the younger consumers, the millennials and Generation Z, which are coming up and really would normally be buying a lot of retail goods, whether that be fashion, whether that be beauty, or that they'd be having families, buying toys, or they would be forming households and buying things for their houses. They are not actually doing that. It's quite a strange statistic, but marriage levels among people in their sort of 20s and 30s have dropped, and also people having children. The rate of the age at which people are having children is moving later and later. So people aren't forming households, and the proportion of people under 30 that are living mainly with their parents is higher than it's been since 1940. So people are not, because of the property prices, people are not able to sort of move on with their lives and do a lot of consuming that they would normally. Yeah, you've got debt your student debt is crippling. You've got the gig economy for a lot of people. The kind of job I got when I was in my early to mid-20s, it had a regular salary, it had guaranteed hours, it had pension arrangements, It had lots of things, and you tended to, unless you wanted to leave, you could stay in that job and have a good career. Now, there's a lot of instability in the job market. You've got these 0 hours contracts, particularly in areas like retailing, where people have got no guarantee of the amount they're going to earn in a given week. Pension arrangements are not what they were. Everywhere you look, there's a high degree of instability. I mean, the rates of people, the length of time that people spend in jobs is much lower than it used to be. So, it's not easy being a young person, and I think that, a lot of people, there's all this stuff about how many products millennials have killed.
Right.
The reality is that for a lot of millennials and Generation Z now growing up, they really can't afford those things. And people say they concentrate on experiences. Well, if you are living in a very constrained space, or you're living with your parents in a constrained space, you can't afford to buy tons and tons of goods because you don't have the capacity to do that. And if you're not able to move on with your life stages and get married, have kids, and do all the things that people do,
which drives the consumer economy, basically the building of a home.
Economy,
yeah.
Can they be blamed for living in the moment?
And the impact on retail, as you describe it, is the fact that they set the trends, if you will, in the retailing marketplace.
And they're setting different trends now. They're setting trends about sustainability, about non-consumption, about renting rather than buying, about buying second-hand rather than buying first-hand. And it's all tied up with the environment, and it's tied up with a move away from conspicuous bling-bling kind of consumption. I mean, their role models are people like, the Steve Jobs and the Mark Zuckerbergs and the Bill Gates. These guys wear sloppy sweatshirts and jeans. I mean, there's an area, a Rolex between them. I mean, the heroes of the tech economy are not. They're not into. It actually reminds me of when I was growing up in the late 60s, early 70s. We didn't dress up in those days. You always wore torn jeans and tried to look as much like a tramp as you could, basically. That was the cool look. And
yes.
I think that, as you say, quite rightly, the young people are setting those trends. They're setting a trend towards kind of much more dressed down, much less kind of conspicuous consumption. It's not cool to do those things anymore. And the brands that represent these idealized perfect images, one thinks of, the Victoria's Secret's Angels or the Abercrombie and Fitch, perfect bodies, with the washboard stomachs. One thinks of the Polo Ralph Lauren Hampton's Gentleman. These kind of images are not appealing to the young people anymore. They see it as being fake. It doesn't tie up with the diversity, the reality of what they see amongst their friends. There's so many different sizes, there's so many different ethnicities, there's so many different points of view.
Oh, absolutely.
Coming out with these rather, what now feel like quite clunky kind of simplistic views of the world, it just doesn't work anymore. So there's a whole kind of anti-brand trend. I mean, it doesn't mean there aren't brands. Of course, there are new brands. But a lot of consumers are opting for new brands rather than the established brands that their parents bought. They're actually actively walking away from the big brands. And that's something that you just didn't. I mean, I've been in business a long time. I've been working in marketing, and you always talked about the brand image and the brand awareness being a huge barrier to entry from new entrants. And most new brands failed. Well, now it almost feels like most new brands are succeeding, and the established brands are the ones that are suffering.
Very interesting. Mark, we don't have a lot more time, but I do want to ask you two more questions, and as quickly as we can. Dollar General, dollar store, that phenomenon in the United States, what does that tell us about retail?
Well, it tells us about the divided society. It tells us that, elements of the luxury businesses are doing well, and these dollar stores are still... Although it's mixed, I mean, you've got some dollar stores that are doing well and some not, but there are some dollar stores that are still doing well. And I think that just shows you how consumption is being squeezed. People are just not able to afford the more mid-market types of brands anymore.
Then you also give a prescription, if you will, and I don't want you to give away the entire book because I think people should go to Barnes & Noble or to a brick-and-mortar store and buy this, not on Amazon. But briefly, I mean, if somebody came up to you today on the street and just said, Mark, give me the one or two ways to try to save retail. What are the most important things that they can learn from all the work that you put into this book and all the research that underlies it?
Sell through your stores, but deliver through the net. Make the internet the backbone of your business, and just use the stores for the bits that the internet can't do. Basically, that is one of the fundamental thoughts behind the book.
And is there some group that has figured that out? Is there someone we could look to and you say, yeah, they've done it that way?
Yes, I mean, there's a whole slew of... The people really have pioneered this route are actually not the retailers, they are the direct-to-consumer brands. And you've mentioned Bonobos. They're a good example. They invented what they call their guide shops, which really just do the consultancy, the fashion consultancy, and they give their customers a beer or a glass of champagne, sit them down, and give them hours of their time, and take as much time. And they show them all the products, they fit them, etc. And then the delivery is all done through the web. And they're much smaller, of course, and intimate. They're a good example. Most of the big direct brands now are doing it. Casper's doing it in mattresses. Warby Parker's doing it in eyeglasses. Lafleur's doing it in ladies' fashion. Everlane's doing it in ladies' fashion. There's some interesting stuff going on in China where Alibaba has got a new store format, which they are using unabashedly, really, for online customer recruitment. And those are grocery stores. And what they've got is that in the grocery stores, they've got about 3,000 SKUs, which you can take away with you, and there's another 50,000 that are online. And the 3,000 are really fresh, cooked product. It's more like a street market where people are cooking the product in front of you, and you can try lots of different things, and be persuaded about the quality, etc. But all the actual ordering and the delivery is all online, and they deliver in urban areas for places within 2 kilometers, I think, or 3 kilometers. They deliver within half an hour. So, they're putting these small stores right in the middle of big conurbations, where there's millions of people. And they're saying, come in the store, experience have the joy of experiencing the thing. And then, most of what you're going to order is, we'll get it to you within half an hour, but it's not going to come through the store. It's coming from somewhere else. And the way they look at that, and they've said this explicitly, is they are trying to recruit people for their online business. So what they do when someone wants to buy something is that they sign them up for the online business there and then in the store, and then they deliver it to them, which educates them already, and they are hoping that they're going to be able to retain them as pure online customers.
And you point that out, that acquisition
yes.
of that name is
yes.
so profoundly important. This is all so fascinating to me, but we're going to end it at this point. But really, just a tremendous book and really a fascinating look at our society through the eyes of our consumerism, which is a huge part, as you say, of our economy and our lifestyle. Retail therapy, why the retail industry is broken, and what can be done to fix it. Mark Pilkington, what an honor to have you on today on America Trends.
Larry, it was absolutely fantastic. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. You're listening to America Trends Podcast, and we're part of the Mental Health News Radio Network at mhnrnetwork.com.